Hello and welcome, I'm Oles Gerjuk and you're watching Head to Head with UATV. Ukrainians will vote in the second round of presidential elections on April the 21st. The two candidates, current President Petro Poroshenko and showman and political novice Volodymyr Zelenskiy, are campaigning hard to win over undecided voters. To discuss this and how the US and EU view these elections, we are joined in the studio today by Bruno Lété, a transatlantic fellow for security and defense at the German Marshall Fund, a US think tank. Hello and thank you for joining us today. So could you please tell us, what do Brussels and Washington think about Ukraine's elections? What do they expect?
Well, obviously, all eyes in Brussels and in Washington are on Ukraine. The elections have been followed very closely by the policymakers and decision makers in this town, not only Brussels or Washington, but also the various capital cities in the European Union. Everyone is very keen to know what the outcome will be of the second round. Will it be Mr. Poroshenko winning? Will it be Mr. Zelensky winning? There's a big stake in it for the European Union and for the United States. The EU and the US has invested heavily in Ukraine in terms of providing resources and assistance since the Maidan Revolution. So obviously we would like to know in Brussels and Washington what the future of Ukraine will be like under which president.
Could you please tell, what do Western analysts know about the current candidates?
Right. Well, Mr. Poroshenko we know very well, of course. Yeah. In the mind of European and American analysts, he also represents continuity. If he wins the election, it's going to be an easy one, because basically we can just continue to do what we have been doing so far with relatively the same people in place. So that would be an easy one if Mr. Poroshenko wins. Mr. Zelensky, however, is a different type of question mark. Just like in Ukraine, also in Brussels or in Washington, we don't really know what Mr. Zelensky stands for. He has been very reserved in expressing his opinions about the future relationship that Ukraine could have, whether it's with the EU or with NATO. Now, on the one hand, Mr. Zelensky has not been negative about the relationship, but neither has he been positive.
Yes.
He actually hasn't expressed any opinion.
Yeah, this is a mystery for us also, and another thing is that his political agenda is well. Lots of critics, lots of analysts are emphasizing and pointing out that the program is kind of vague, and we can't be sure how does he want to implement every other paragraph out of his program. But at the same time, we do know that he keeps some negotiations and keeps some talks with the IMF. Today he's having some meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron, but none of us knows the outcomes because he doesn't really talk to media much, although he's a very well-known media person and showman. Do you think this is some kind of phenomena, or do you think that this is a bit dangerous for a presidential candidate not to speak to the audience?
Well, obviously, it's important to express opinions as a presidential candidate, but perhaps in this respect, foreign policy has not been the top priority for the election campaign of Mr. Zelensky. We have heard Mr. Poroshenko saying a lot about the relationship with the European Union, with the United States, so definitely there the vector is very clear. But perhaps Mr. Zelensky has different priorities in his campaign. Now, I think what I also would like to say, and to add to this conversation, what we also think in Brussels and Washington is there has been so much progress going on in our relationship, the relationship between Ukraine and the European Union and the United States, that there's also some trust that whoever wins the presidential elections, Ukraine's Western orientation will remain in place. So much has been invested in the past 5 years by Ukrainian civil society, but also with the support of international partners. Whether Mr. Zelensky wins or whether Mr. Poroshenko wins, it would be hard to undo all these achievements.
Well, so you believe that this is a steady process, that we can rely on the same vector in the same direction with any president?
Well, I think there's two scenarios here. The one scenario is basically we keep doing what we're doing right now, meaning that Ukraine and the European Union or the United States keeps on broadening and deepening the relationship with more and more and more and more projects coming in. That's the scenario right now. The other scenario would be a scenario where things do not get dismantled, they remain in place, but nothing new is coming on top. meaning that the agenda will become less ambitious. So it's not about Ukraine sliding back to where Ukraine was before Maidan, it's just about the relationship no longer moving forward because of lack of willingness or ambition, and that the second scenario is a risk.
Well, but also Ukraine's this Euro-Atlantic aspirations are enshrined in the constitution now. This was the initiative of the current president, Petro Poroshenko. Do you think that something can shift us from this path?
I mean, obviously there are many threats, many risks to Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic ambitions. The country is de facto still at war, let's not forget that. Sometimes in Brussels and Washington we have easily talking, but this country is de facto at war. But not only security reasons, let's think about the economy. Ukraine's economy is perhaps not in best of shape. There are, serious challenges. Think about the relationship with the IMF. So the standard of living has to be improved, salaries have to raise, so it's also about the people, it's about economic security. It's actually a mix of economic, social and hardcore security challenges that shapes the future of this country, and all these must be tackled. Reforms remain important in that sense, and if these reforms are not coming, there might be some disappointment or at least the constitutional text may just remain text.
I understand your point. Well, you just reminded the cooperation with the IMF, and it's crucial for Ukraine. Of course, we're waiting for the next tranche. Hopefully, it's gonna happen soon. But still, at the same time, how do you think the presidential elections and the level of scandal around these elections, how can they reflect, or can they reflect anyhow, on the cooperation with the IMF?
Well, you mentioned scandals. I think, after all, it's been pretty civilized when you look at the election process sometimes in Western countries. Scandals are always part of campaigns, although the ones that were in Ukraine were pretty hefty as well, for sure. I mean, look, the IMF, in my opinion, is one of the three crucial relationships that Ukraine has. It's EU, it's NATO, and it's IMF. Those three relationships have to be maintained if Ukraine is to work with international partners, face some of the challenges that it's facing. So if I was president of Ukraine in the future, I will not be, but if I were, I would definitely dedicate my attention to those relationships.
Of course.
International partners are key to Ukraine's future success.
Well, speaking again of the second round of the elections and the election campaign and the candidates, as I said, Volodymyr Zelenskiy is a novice in politics. From your personal opinion, can this work out? Because in Ukraine, people are divided onto those who really believe in this change, because the person has no minuses, basically, because the person has no political career at all.
Sure.
The other ones are pretty skeptical that the person without political past can head the whole state in Ukraine. We know that it's the biggest state in Europe.
Can it work out? I mean, I will be interested to see where Mr. Zelenskyy's first foreign trip will be. I think that will be very indicative of his foreign policy vector. And in the end, diplomacy is always sometimes very practical. I'm pretty sure that if Mr. Zelensky wins the election, if he becomes the next president of Ukraine, there will be immediately an army of US and EU diplomats coming to Kiev seeking a dialogue and conversation with him, and actually at least supporting his presidency with advice from capitals such as Brussels and Washington. So I'm sure that the West will engage with Mr. Zelensky. There's no doubt about that. The question is whether Mr. Zelensky will listen to this engagement or not. That is the key question.
Will he have enough political will to adhere to this course? This is very interesting, and we are also awaiting to hear more concrete comments on this from Mr. Zelensky and from Mr. Poroshenko during the presidential debate. We do have another scandal. Whether the debate is going to happen or not, let's hope that it will, and we will have more information to think about and to come up with some solutions, especially for Ukrainians, as for voters. So far, I thank you for your opinions. Thank you for information that you delivered, and thank you for being in our studio.
Thank you for the invitation.
That was Bruno Lété, a transatlantic fellow for security and defense at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Thank you for watching Head to Head, and stay tuned for more with UATV.